Welcome to Sovereign Sailing's tutorial on working out height of tide and the use of a tidal curve. Before doing this tutorial, there is some basic tidal information and tidal knowledge that you will need to have pre-doing this. So you really need some background tidal knowledge. For example, you need knowledge of what causes our tides on a global scale, the interaction of the moon, the earth, and the sun as in causing our tides. We need to know where to find that tidal information. So we need to be very comfortable with reading tidal tables. We do need an awareness of what springs and neaps are and what our tidal range is. And you also need a knowledge of some terms such as charted depth, chart datum, etc. So really our aim for this tutorial is to work out. We're going to use a practical example, and we're going to use a harbour that's quite close to us here in Kinsale called Cormac's, which has a tidal constraint. We know that from reading our cruising guide, there is a sand bar at the entrance to Cormac's, and that we need to work out what height of tide is required to get into and out of Cormac's. So really our aim for today is to work out when can we get into Cormac's without it ending like this. So what kind of information do we need to start gathering to figure out when we can get into Cormac's? Well, the first step really is to look at Cormac's itself, look at the chart and inspect the chart. What is the minimum depth that we are going to experience that is actually on the chart? So we call that the charted depth. So that's step one, is to look at our chart and find out the charted depth. Step two is more related to our own individual boat. How much water do we need? What's the draft of our boat? And step three is then to go and look at the particular times and heights of the tide for that specific day that you want to get into Cormac's. So that's reading the tide tables. Okay, so step one, looking at our chart. So we have a good look, and we have a look at our cruising guides, we have a look at our charts, our navionics, whatever resources are available to us, and we inspect our planned pilotage into Cormac's. So we are going to be following the boys here, going into Cormac's and going all the way up here to the town. So we inspect that route and we find out where is the shallowest point that we're going to cross. And we know from reading the cruising guide that there's a sandbar at the entrance to Cormac's. So here it is, the sandbar, and we can see in the middle of that sandbar where we intend to cross, there's 1 meter charted depth. So this is key. This is our charted depth. We need to write that down. 1 meter charted depth. So now it's on step two, which is our own specific boat. So what depth of water do we need? So our boat really dictates that. In this particular case, we're using a scenario of our boat, typical 40-foot boat, has a draft of 2 meters. And then we ask ourselves, are we happy with 2 meters? Do we want some clearance underneath the keel? Or are we happy to literally scrape in there with a few centimeters underneath the keel? And we would like standard practice. We would like to have a clearance underneath our keel. And I like to use a meter clearance as a minimum. So we want to have 1 meter underneath our keel. So now the question is, how much water, what's the minimum depth of water that we're happy with going into Cormac's, crossing over that bar? And really the answer to that is it's a combination of our draft and our clearance. So that's 3 meters, the depth of water that we require. Okay, so now we need to kind of relate that back, that 3 meters. So is that what we're looking for? Are we looking for 3 meters tide? Or is there already some depth there that's given to us and we don't necessarily need the full 3 meters of tide? So we know, looking back at our first step, we know that there's a charted depth in Cormac's. So from chart datum down, we know that the charted depth is 1 meter. So our question is, how much water on top of that do we need? Okay, so that is the height of tide. What height of tide on top of the charted depth do we need? We know that in total we need 3 meters, which is a combination of our draft, 2 meters, and our clearance, 1 meter. So we need 3 meters depth of water. The charted depth, so at lowest astronomical tide, we always have 1 meter. So what we are now looking for is a height of tide of 2 meters. So this is a really vital piece of information. So we write this down, big bold letters, height of tide, 2 meters. Step 3 now is to go and look at our tidal times and heights for a particular day. So our day in question today is Sunday, the 14th of March, and it's the afternoon that we're looking to get into Cormac-Sherry. So we look at the tides and we can see that high water tide is at 18:04 and low water is at 12:25. So really we want to know when is the earliest between low and high water that we can get in. So we need to pull out 3 bits of information from this. We need to pull out our high water time and height and write that down. So high water, 18:04, and the height is 3.9 meters. And the third bit of information we need is our low water height, 0.5 of a meter. Okay, so these are key pieces of information you pluck out of your tide tables. So in total, we're going to have 4 key pieces of information now. We're going to know that our height of tide required is 2 meters. We know our high water time today is 18:04 and its height is 3.9 meters. And we know that low water height is 0.5 of a meter. So with those 4 bits of information, we can now go to our tidal curve, enter in that information, and that will give us a time at which we can safely enter Cormac-Sherry.
We're looking at our tidal curve now. We've got our 4 pieces of information. So I'm going to write them down here. Our first key bit of information was that the height of tide that we need is 2 meters. So we're looking for a height of tide of 2 meters, which will allow us to get into Cormac-Sherry with the required depth of water. That's our first bit of information. The second piece of information we took was high water time was at 18:04. So I fill that in here in the center and I will populate all of these boxes. So high water -1, and I go all the way back here to low water, and on the other side I have high water +1, 19:04, and I add an hour all the way in here. So I populate those. Okay, so now that we've got all of our times in here, the 2 other bits of information we need are our heights. So high water, we know, is 3.9 meters. So we mark that off here on the high water scale. So we mark off 3.9. On the low water scale down here, we mark off 0.5 for today's low water. Then we join a diagonal between low water and high water. Okay, now we look at our height of tide that we're looking for is 2 meters. So we take 2 meters either from below or above. So I'll take it from below, 2 meters, and we bring this up till it meets the diagonal. We then bring it across till it intersects the tidal curve. And I'll extend it across here. So it intersects the tidal curve, 2 spots, here and here. And now what I do is I project those lines back down to the time here. And here. And it gives us 2 times. So it's going to give us a time here. This is 1504. So 14, let's say 1455 is this time here. And we've got 2104. We say 21, approximately 21:30. So this gives us the earliest that we could get into Courtmacsherry with our required height of tide is 1455. And then the tide is on the way up. Tide comes up high and then tide goes back out. If we were to leave the same day, we would have to be gone at the absolute latest of 21:30. Now we've worked out our height of tide calculation for Courtmacsherry and we've related it back to time. So we have a window between 1455 and 21:30 at which time we can get in and out of Courtmacsherry over this bar over here.